What's up, everybody? A few months ago, I spoke to a group of game company CEOs and we had a discussion on the role of the CEO at gaming companies. And while there were some distinct similarities, there were also some pretty big differences in terms of focus, allocation of time, and even priority of roles and responsibilities. Today, the more finance oriented perspective of the role of the CEO, as popularized by Warren Buffett as a capital allocator, has become quite popular. But there are also other popular views like the venture capital view in terms of funding, hiring, finding product market fit, and scaling, and the operations oriented view, more typical at larger companies oriented around people, process, and technology. So, how should we think about the role of the CEO? And more importantly, what makes a great CEO? So, I wanted to dig into this. And because I know a lot of dope people, I brought them on to talk about exactly this. In our discussion today, we have first Gigi Levy-Weiss, former CEO and investor in some pretty well-known gaming companies like Playtika and Plarium, and now general partner at the prestigious venture capital firm NFX. Second, we have Brian Peganoff, former vice president of tech, media, and telecom, specializing in video games at Deutsche Bank, and more recently, former senior director of corporate development and strategy at Glue Mobile. And finally, Kristian Segerstrale, former co-founder of Glue Mobile, former CEO and co-founder of Playfish, acquired by EA, co-founder of Initial Capital, seed investor in Supercell, and currently CEO of the games company with the best name in games, Super Evil Megacorp. So we have some really relevant but different perspectives today. A former CEO and current venture capitalist, corp strat, as well as finance and entrepreneur and current CEO perspectives on this issue of what makes a great games company CEO. Anyway, let's get this started, starting right now. Hey guys, welcome. I thought we could go ahead and start with this first question around the most basic and fundamental question when it comes to a games company CEO, which is really, what does the games company CEO do? What should be the focus of the CEO? And Kristian, since you're first in my window here, maybe you could start.
Sure. So in general, I guess the way that I view the CEO job, and having done it for a while, I suppose, I feel like the single most important determinant of the outcome of game companies tends to be the talent. So finding the absolute best talent in the industry for the job that you're, or the game or the games that you're building, and holding on to your superstars, and building a great culture and modeling the culture and making sure everyone's feeling good and everyone's able to do their best work. So the mix of talent and culture, in my mind, from both a recruitment perspective as well as, if you like, a maintenance internal building perspective, is the number one job, I think, for a game company CEO at all times. I would say the second job, which some investors would argue is the first job, is to not run out of cash. So you need to constantly play devil's advocate, constantly have a plan B, plan C, plan D, however many plans. And then at the end, there's the blockchain pivot right now that you have to constantly keep in mind, depending on what it is that you're working on. But not running out of cash, I think, is your second job. And then honestly, after that comes everything else in terms of execution discipline and making sure that you're hitting your targets and that your investors are happy and all other things. But in my mind, talent absolutely at the top, both your existing talent as well as that, how do I get the absolute best person in the industry to join me on this venture?
Right. And Kristian, if you were to think about the amount of time that a CEO spends across those three objectives, like how would you roughly allocate the time allocation between those objectives?
I think it's situational.
Okay.
But overall, I would make sure that in any given day, at least half the day is ultimately spent on some mix of either recruitment, your existing talent, and listening to their needs and making sure that you have the right people in the right place, and that you're listening to them and that they're working well together. That should be probably at least half your day. And then probably the rest then gets divided up between not running out of cash and looking after long-term things, external things, and all that other stuff.
Right. And maybe Brian, if you can kind of weigh in, and I think it's great that you kind of have a different background from Kristian and Gigi as well, in the sense that you kind of come from more of the investment banking finance background as well as corp dev, corp strat background at Glue most recently. And so, from your perspective, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think the kind of the classic textbook example would be that the main responsibility is driving value to stakeholders. So ideally, a CEO spends most of their time focusing on what drives the most impact for the company, and usually that kind of like value to stakeholders is deemed as financial, but it doesn't always have to be. And like the way Christian's talking about culture and bringing people along for the ride is really very much like the hard part about the CEO role that I think a lot struggle with. Yeah, but as a company grows and matures, that like the universe of stakeholders widens, and you have more employees, and you have a more competitive environment. You have a larger set of investors, reporting requirements, and then a bigger environmental and social footprint, which is getting much more necessary these days to tackle. So like the job gets big and increasingly complex, and it happens kind of fast in this environment. So the best CEOs do a few things exceptionally well. I hear that a lot. I think I found that to be true in practice, and that kind of forms their style, like a product CEO, a deal CEO, culture CEO, or some sort of mix. And for the other stuff, they do a really good job of delegating and trusting folks that they deem appropriate to guide the company along with their general culture and values. I guess the other part is that, when I worked at DB, I supported a group of client relationships of hedge funds and asset managers for the head of global markets, and that guy eventually became the CEO like a year later. So we saw firsthand, like, they're very good at markets businesses, but all of a sudden they're spending time elsewhere with regulators or investors or other business units or politicians. But as a general rule of thumb, like, clients have the most impact on an investment banking business, so that's where they're going to spend their time. And for gaming, it's just a lot different. I think Kristian nailed it. It's like, in my experience with gaming CEOs, a lot of their time is spent with like their people and the people that are making their products.
Right. And Gigi, as a venture capitalist, you talk to CEOs all the time, and I'm sure you're evaluating a lot of teams and CEOs specifically. So, from your perspective, what do you think?
Yeah, so first of all, I think I was a CEO many more years and times than I'm a venture capitalist. So
Okay.
I don't call myself a venture capitalist. The way I see
Okay.
myself as an oppressed entrepreneur that now just fulfills my entrepreneurial desires through other people's labor and passion and love, and then I join them for the ride. So I think I'll talk about it more as as from my perspective as CEO, and maybe less as a VC. And clearly in a normal situation, I would just say that Kristian got it right and move on, but that would be inappropriate to me just saying that Kristian's right. That's just impossible. And so
I don't actually think I've ever heard those words come out of
I
Gigi's
know, I
mouth
know,
ever.
I
So
know,
can
Kristian,
we
I
edit
know.
this piece? Can we just edit that piece and just repeat that comment 10 times over, and then I'll have it on
So
autoplay here behind the
yeah,
scenes.
we've been in various discussions and panels, and I don't think I ever said that. I really wished he wouldn't say people, because then it would have said game designer or something. I mean, yes, but instead he just said the right thing. So I think that Kristian got it right, but I want to add my more extended perspective. And by the way, you asked how much. So I actually have like a rule of thumb that
Oh,
a startup CEO generally needs to spend around 25% of their time interviewing people. It sounds like crazy, but until you have your full team in place, and the reality is not just because you need to interview anybody, just because at the end of the day, you're going to have a much more impact. In a very competitive labor market, you're going to have such a bigger impact on the candidate than anybody else. So I would interview not just the people that report directly to me or the ones below that, but basically today, when you're trying to get the best talent, you need to come with your passion and with your weight as a founder and into almost any discussion. And so it goes from 25 up to 1/3 of the time when you're really into it. But I think that I'll take a step backwards, and I'll say that I always saw the roles of the CEO as basically a dual role that is really it's really important, because there's two types of thing the CEO does. One of it is management, and the other one is leadership. And you basically need to do both of them. And I think the management type is where it's fairly simple. And the management time in a company, the way I see it, I basically put it out many years ago into this very simple way for me to look at it, which is that you start by defining a strategy, then you verify that you have the right team to fulfill that strategy, then you set goals or KPIs to make sure that you're measuring everything. Then you basically let them run with the strategy, the vector and the people, and you just look from the side and help them and assist wherever they need, then monitor it. And then you go back again to another cycle of verifying that the strategy is right, verifying that the team is right, making sure that the KPIs are right, and then again letting them work and so on and so on. And what I found is that, and it used to be like you did this every year when I looked at corporates many years ago, and then it became shorter and shorter. And startups basically kind of do it every month. Like every month, you can ask yourself, are we in the right direction, and do we have the right team, and do we have the right KPIs, and then you work for a month. But in games companies, it's probably like every version. Right, every version you put out, you ask yourself, are the numbers going in the right direction? Do I have the right team? If they're not, then what's the problem? And then am I measuring the right things? And you just go on. So that's the managerial thing, and we can get into it. But then there's a whole layer around it, which I think is the bigger thing, which is I break it down to people, vision, and culture. And and we can talk about each one of these in depth. But as a leader, the CEO's main role is to deal with with the people, and we can talk about it for hours. You need to make sure that you've got the right vision in place. And the vision is basically the story of the company and where you want to take it, and that is critical, not just for investors. It's critical for employees and for people you want to recruit, and that's it, and so on. And then, of course, the culture, the DNA of the company, which I think, in at least the games company, is super unique. And I think we should talk about that a bit later. But it's this unique DNA that the game company CEO needs to put in place. And so, for me, it's a combination of being a great manager, which is almost like being a great project manager of that process that I mentioned before, and then wrapping it with with the people, culture, and vision, which I think all three are super different in game companies than they are in other startups. And so it's this combination that I'm looking for, and this combination that I'm trying to help game companies basically achieve.
Got it. Now, one thing that wasn't mentioned.
I'd agree with that. So if
Okay.
I can,
Go for it.
So can I interject
Yeah,
super
please.
quick? The one thing that I see that a lot of, especially newer CEOs, sometimes kind of forget, because in your eagerness to do everything, because there's so many things to be done, like there's a game to be made and there's all of these other things that need to get done. A lot of the time, it's a really useful question to ask. This specific task that I'm thinking of doing today, am I the only person who can do it? Or could somebody else do it?
Right.
Like the really very quickly, in particular for product-oriented CEOs, typically spend honestly far too much time on product versus taking a step back and spending time on people and actually recruitment and all of the other things that go into the job. So I think a useful question is like, I really like Gigi's broader framework. A useful question is, in that, what is it that will also be other people's jobs and I can hold somebody else accountable for and be supportive, versus actually jumping in and doing? Because otherwise your days become easily 15-hour days. You keep super busy, but you actually don't accomplish nearly as much as if you find more time to take a step back and look at the whole.
I think that's perfectly right. I'd also say that, again, the way to think about that is to think about how you create scalability in your company. And basically, when you do things, even if you're better than the other person that can do that, and then you're working on something that is not scalable. And sometimes you should, right? Your game is failing. The core loop is not working. You're the person that has the best knowledge to do that. Yeah, you drop everything and you help. But generally speaking, your impact, if you bring the next product person, or if you bring the next monetization or the next designer, your impact of doing that is going to be 10x than doing that job yourself. And that's how you need to constantly think about it. How do you put in place people that you can then just instruct and just monitor, rather than actually do their job, which is going to take all your time? And many times, game CEOs indeed forget that.
So, Kristian, in terms of like product-oriented CEOs that you mentioned, if we think about arguably one of the greatest CEOs of our time, or potentially of all time, is Elon Musk. And he at least claims that he spends most of his time on the product side. And so if you were to think about a great CEO and allocating time between being more product oriented or spending time on some of the key issues or focus that you mentioned, is that more situational, or how would you think about when is it okay or good for a CEO to be spending more time on product, for example?
Well, so I guess my point of view is I think CEOs come in different flavors. I
Right.
think I'm a huge believer in playing to your strengths. So if you're a product oriented person, if that is who you are fundamentally, in particular early stage in the company, like that's where I would be spending most of my time early on, while then spending all the rest of my time in terms of figuring out how do I scale this and how do I hire for my own weaknesses, the things that I don't want to be spending time on in general. And I need to obviously hire even stronger people in that area. I need to hire strong people everywhere. But in particular, in areas that I don't want to spend that much time on myself, I need to hire basically co-founder level folks who will be spending more time in those areas. So I think being product oriented, in particular early on in a startup, is actually a superpower, I would say. But I do think that it requires a lot of self-awareness that will ultimately not scale. I liked how the way Gigi put it. It just doesn't scale for you to be doing the job post like product market fit. If you until product market fit, or everything is like legal. If you like, you can, however, you need to get the product market fit one way or the other. But as you ultimately start doing your job in terms of trying to build the most valuable company over time, that scalability point is really, really important. You need to make sure that you ultimately hire the folks who can do the job without you, so that you can be there to support, but ultimately look after the broader growth of the team, the recruitment, and everything else. So yeah, I think play to your strengths, make sure that you hire really well in the other areas, and then ultimately make sure that the thing scales even in the area that you love.
Right. And to your point, Kristian, it's not like a CEO is the only person at the company. So like if for some of those other critical roles, if you have a co-founder, if you have other people as part of the broader executive team that can fulfill some of those roles, then maybe you're okay. And then it would be more situational and you play to your strengths.
Yeah. I think if I can jump in, I think that
Yeah.
at the end of the day, I don't think the CEO needs to be necessarily the best in anything. However, I have found that a bunch of things. The first thing I've found is that all game company CEOs must be good in data. It's almost impossible today to really lead your team if you're not really great in looking and analyzing data. You don't need to write the queries, but you need to basically be able to look and understand what's happening. That is almost impossible to be without. The second thing is that I think that being a CEO without having at least one superpower. So one area where you're considered to be, at least one of the best people in the company or the best is super tough. And I think that it can't be, depending on the games on the game company type, we'll talk about it in a second, it can't be anything. So I don't think that you can be the best person in tech and be great. And so the tech superpower is not necessarily one that's going to get you to be the leader, the great leader of a games company. What I've seen is that it can be either game design superpower, right? So somebody that's really good in game design. It could be, in some cases, somebody who's really, really good in monetization for the type of games that are based on monetization. So that's basically the extreme of data and CRM and campaign management and so on. I have seen at least one game company where the leader was really, really good in marketing, but that proved to be not a very strong superpower over time, right? It didn't really buy that person the long-term leadership in the company that we would have expected. And so I think that if I sum this up, I think that you do need a superpower probably, and that superpower is best when I look at game company CEOs and I see literally, I don't know, tens a month at least, then the ones that are not with product superpower or data monetization superpower are tougher for me to believe in. Okay, and then of course when I look at the team, I see what's their superpower, and I expect to see the complementary superpower with the rest of the team. But that's that's one of the two I usually try to see.
Got it. And if we were to think then about maybe even some specific examples, like people in the industry, whether it's at public companies or otherwise, people we should be following or looking to as a good example of a great CEO, who do you guys think could be an example or someone we should be looking to? And maybe starting with you, Brian?
Yeah, sure. I think most of my experience in the video game industry has been like following the public companies. But I think one example that I like a lot would be kind of a CEO, but not really. Phil Spencer from Microsoft. He's been on stage for the Xbox brand since like 2010. So it's one of those rare instances where the CEO has some credibility with the consumers directly, which you don't see very often. In 2014, Satya took over for Ballmer. And at many points along the Microsoft long-term plan, they could have said goodbye to Xbox, but Satya actually doubled down, put Spencer in charge to lead Xbox and Microsoft Studios. In the 2018 timeframe, the Fortnite success started to trickle over into the public space and highlighted how strong the business was from a console perspective. And they started giving more detailed color about the business to investors, which went well. It's just good to see over that time frame that company really continue to embrace gaming alongside the rest of the industry. He's also been very vocal on things like crossplay and open platforms and things like that. It's been very healthy for the industry. Today it's 20 years later, and a strong growing subscription business, and they're selling more Xboxes they can make. That's a great example. Another one, I know you're a fan of Tim Sweeney, JK, but the main thing that I like about him is his openness to be uncomfortable in new platforms, kind of pushing against the grain of the industry that's been going a certain direction for a long time. I think that speaks volumes, and both of those guys, I think, would be someone that folks would be excited to work for, and I think that's kind of the beginnings of a great work culture.
Cool. Gigi?
Yeah. When I think about it, I mostly think about the people that I work with closely. And so, if I think about different CEOs, I'd see different patterns and on how they work. And also clearly very interesting, given the fact that many of them came in different co-founders combinations. So, if I look at Playtika, for example, Robert is the data monetization driven CEO, who is very much into the data of the company as much as any analyst in the company up till today, when the company is, we're a $10 billion company. And that was always his superpower, being on top of the numbers and knowing exactly what's happening in every game at any point. He did not have necessarily the game design superpower, but he had a co-founder called Uri, who was one of the best game designers I've ever met with. And basically together they created that great combination of somebody leading product and somebody leading data monetization that got the company to be what it is. When I look at a company like Plarium, which was a more core gaming company, and where the game design was a more complex thing, then most of the founders and the CEO were more game people, game design people than data people. And then they basically added capabilities to their team. There were 4 founders. They added capabilities to their team to make sure that they supplement everything else. But their core passion was game design, and they were gamers and they liked the core gaming, and they continued doing it. And they basically would continue sitting in game design meetings, years into the company being worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And then maybe the most interesting one is Moon Active, where Muli, the founder CEO, is the solo CEO, solo founder. Solo CEO, of course, but solo founder. And Muli, interestingly enough, has this unique capability of being both a product guy and a monetization guy. And I think that in his particular case, without being both of these as a solo founder, it would have been impossible. And so I think that, and again, I would also want to take a step back and say that I very much see that the right character of the CEO depends a lot on what kind of game company you're setting up. And I think that you can't put somebody who's monetization driven to build the Supercell, right? Ilka is clearly a game design driven person, and I don't think that the same company, the same DNA would even be there if the CEO, the founder CEO, were monetization driven. Vice versa, I think that putting Ilka to run Playtika would probably not get the company far. In terms of optimizing revenues and optimizing retention and core loops and so on. So it's really interesting to see how there really is in the greatest companies. There's a great match between the DNA and the character and the superpower of the CEO to the actual DNA of the company needs to succeed.
Right. And Kristian?
Yeah, no, those are some really, really great points. I think those are really true for early stage companies in particular. I'd call out a couple of maybe later stage companies where I think to some degree it still holds that it needs like the company and the CEO to sort of be compatible that way, but also like there are in particular, I call out two CEOs who I think have done a great job at identifying like the nature of the beast, if you like, of the company, and then really focusing on execution around that. Like one is like calling out, say, Frank Gibault at Zynga, because I mean he inherited a company that was attempting to build a lot of games, and he looked at it and goes, okay, we're going to implement a very M&A driven strategy moving forward, and has done incredibly well in that regard, over the past several years in terms of building ultimately a very diverse, with company with multiple very successful studios and doing these, which is pretty cool. I mean, in terms of the impact he's had on that company, or say take Nicola Laurent of Riot doing a similar thing where they were basically a one game company until he took over, and of course with other things in development, but nothing quite shipping, and then just doing that very disciplined management and execution job from there onwards, and then becoming a multi-title developer from there onwards. So I think a lot of it ultimately, I really agree with Gigi on the making sure that the company that you want to build as a CEO like matches your own strengths, and that you are deeply into making sure that the strengths that this company needs that you're building like 3 years from now, 5 years from now in its mature state match either, like ideally they match really the strengths that you have and the kind of future that you want to will into being, but also that your core team is there, because right. I think especially the early years of any game company is a lot of hand-to-hand combat. It's just a relentless seeking of product market fit one way or the other, and then scaling that up. And it is just infinitely easier to do that when there is a strong fit between what you yourself want to see and want to play or want to work with, or want to see happen, and the product that you're actually making. Because game making is hard, building companies are hard. If it actually matches right. your passion and your strength, it's a little bit easier.
Right. And I know we've talked about specific focus of a CEO, we've talked about certain people, but if you were to try and generalize maybe specific qualities that would make a CEO a great CEO, do you guys think about any specific qualities that a great CEO should have, or is it more situational? And again, maybe we can start with you, Brian, in terms of your thoughts.
Yeah, I think the qualities that I found to be the most settling would be like confidence and conviction in the company's strategy. And again, I think this is mostly in the public stock lens, but you get a different sense whenever you're talking to a CEO of a well-run company in a certain setting. Like they understand the environment they're operating in. They understand the pressures they're seeing from competition. They understand how to keep their people engaged and selling or making the product. And like they also know how to handle investors, because that's like the part of like the company scaling that's really critical is after, well, you get to scaling, right? And then it's either like the exit. You're going to sell to another company, you're going to go public. The going public discussion and decision is like a very hard and complex one. And they have figured out over time how to separate like the long-term stock narrative vision and like investor expectations away from kind of the minutia of running the business on a 3 to 6 month time frame. And being very confident in doing that and taking the lumps when they need to. And I think you see good examples of that in the market. That's probably my top one.
All right. And what do you think, Kristian?
I think my top one is like, I guess it's a mix of two things. I think early on, it's sort of a certain form of killer instinct, if you like. Just the go-get instinct, being able to call a spade, being able to kill a game if you need to kill a game, being able to close your key hires, just go and figure it out. Like if you need to jump on a plane to go close the hire, so be it. If you need to troll through 5,000 LinkedIn profiles to find the right person, so be it. Like that sort of mix of just being able to go and get is incredibly important, and the resilience that right. I think comes with that early on. I think like in the very quickly after that, the minute you actually have some people and you have a product, I think your clarity, if you like, of communication and your ability to attract great talent, your ability to maintain a vision, build a good home for that talent, and build a place where people feel like they really want to work hard, they really want to give their everything for success over time, I think is that sort of the for the scaling phase of the company in particular becomes really important. And then I think the more mature you become, the more important it becomes to also then be able to be super smart about your financial strategy and be kind of very thoughtful about what are the long-term kind of capabilities and needs for the company. But that especially early on, just the sort of ruthlessness of just being able to get it done one way or the other, get it done.
Yeah, I really like your notion of what you're calling killer instinct. I call it, based upon the Jim Harbaugh philosophy, I call it cruelty, but yeah, I think that's great. And Gigi, what do you think?
Yeah, so I'll agree with everything that was said. I think that at the end of the day, and I'm speaking about early stage, at the end of the day, what you really want to be able to create is an amazing team that has an iterative culture that never ceases to iterate until it gets to where it should get. And just to get this into perspective, I think that in a normal software company, you'd probably have, call it 25 real experiments that you're doing in a month. In a game company, you'd have probably 4 to 10 times that in a month, right? And including versions and changes and tests and whatever. And so what that requires is basically creating a culture of iterations and failure, fix, failure, fix, failure, fix, measure, improve, measure, improve, measure, improve, that does not exist at that extreme in any non-games company, at least not at that pace. And I think that specific capability of a games company that I think is required, even if you're a real proper AAA data-driven, creative-driven company, you still need to constantly see what's happening, what are the customers doing, whether they love it or not. And I think that sits upon basically, three building blocks. One of it is creating a culture in the company that is really, really, really all about data and measuring things all the time. The second thing is about your ability to constantly tell a compelling story that is convincing, even if yesterday's version failed, even if the current numbers are not great. You shift and you tell the next story, and you shift and you tell the next story, and every time you need to be really convinced, and you need to drive people, because what I found is that you need to basically energize people like 2-3x more than you need in a normal company, because there's all these mini changes and all these mini failures, and this is not working, this version is not converting better, and so on and so on. And all of that basically, you can aggregate it all into building the right culture for a games company, which I think is very different than the right culture for most other companies, or even more specifically, the right culture for your type of game company, which could differ from different game companies. And this is where I've seen great CEOs succeed. It's never been around a single capability or a single thing. It's been around that, creating that DNA, that culture, that ability to iterate and never stop until you're getting to where you need to get to.
Got it. Okay. For a next question, I kind of have a personal theory that I wanted to kind of test on you guys and see what you guys think. But just speaking to different people in the games industry, it seems like if I were to characterize kind of different lenses by which people view the CEO role, it seems like there's kind of different perspectives. And so, one I would call maybe like the typical VC perspective, and kind of similar to what we're talking about, a good CEO should like raise money, hire good people, help find product market fit, help scale a company. Then there's more the finance view, which is more around and kind of getting increasingly popular here in Silicon Valley, which is the view of the CEO as a capital allocator and kind of the Warren Buffett sort of style. And then there's more of maybe the large company or the typical consulting view. Like, I don't know if you guys have seen like the McKinsey presentations with like people, process, technology, the three bubbles, and then like how you optimize against that. But wondering if you guys would agree as far as these different perspectives, and then, what do you guys think as far as how like these different points of view on the role of a CEO, if you guys have any thoughts? And maybe starting with you, Brian, as far as, and maybe you could speak to like the finance view in particular.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to lump CEOs into three categories, but I think it's a pretty fair representation. The ones that we ran into mostly in the public markets and still do is like number three. A lot of mega cap video game companies will kind of operate in that model. I think pretty easy to name a few. The finance view is like, it's tough in this environment to stand out against other investors. Do you want me to keep going, Joe?
Yeah, go ahead.
There's a lot of democratization and decent research and equities, and when a company is frequently engaged in M&A, like the culture becomes harder to define. So I think that's where that kind of runs into some snags. But the magic part is whenever you have a typical VC view for an early stage company, they do all those things correctly, and then hand off to that kind of number 3 for public markets. But I think increasingly what we're seeing in public markets is more of those number ones there, the typical VC view, enter into public markets before they really have hit scale. You're probably seeing a bit of that even like over the past few weeks with companies that are like Rivian and things like that are launching this week. You're seeing a lot of really good stories launching in the market that don't necessarily have scale yet.
Right. And Gigi, as I know you consider yourself more of an operator than a venture capitalist, but what do you think?
I think that there is a big question of whether so let's start backwards. I think the beginning of the company, clearly it's your first type, right? The person that recruits the talent, is hands deep in the making, trying to move the company fast, raise money, all of that. That's clearly at the beginning. There's nothing else. I think that what happens is that some companies end up staying with the same lever for success, even when they're huge. So you look at a Supercell, or you look at I don't know, even a Moon Active right now. Then the main lever is still building games and making them successful. And so the CEO didn't need to change. Clearly, needed to learn how to operate at a different scale. Needed to learn how to create a much more thorough management, manage more studios. At the beginning, you could say that the CEO at the beginning is like head of HR and head of product design, and then as the company grows, the CEO is like head of studio. And they like the GM of the studio, and then as the company grows, they become the head of studios because there's a few, and then as the company grows more, becomes the CEO and gets a head of studios to run the studio. So clearly that changes, but as long as the lever for success for the company didn't change, the characteristic of the CEO don't need to change dramatically. However, for example, if you become a public company and your strategy moves from creating new games to mostly buying new games, then suddenly the capabilities that got the company, the CEO capabilities that got the company to where it is, are not necessarily the same ones that are needed for the future. And so in that point, either you need a different CEO, potentially that what you could say about Zynga, right? The company became an M&A machine, you need a different CEO. Right. It's no longer about necessarily building games, it's about, creating this M&A machine. And so the question about the change in the CEO's role and the change in CEO types depends a lot of whether there's a real change in the levers of success for the company. That's the way I look at it.
Okay, Kristian.
Actually, I have very little to add to that. I really agree with it. I think the CEO needs to play to their strengths, what they're really good at, and try to build the company that way. If at some point in time it turns out that the success factors of the market are different and requires a different kind of company to be built, then there's a really good question as to whether that CEO should still be the CEO at that moment in time, or whether it's just better to swap at that moment in time.
Right.
Or add the token, whatever works.
Gigi's last point was what makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's a lot of companies out there that would be considered new paper, or like single business units that are public that are kind of shifting from that number 1 to the number 2, like typical VC view, more to like a finance view. How do I be an allocator in this space? Like, what space am I in to begin with, and then what do I buy? And I think that's a different skill set than the folks that are working on product.
Yeah, and to your point, Gigi, I guess that makes sense in terms of those different perspectives of a CEO, that it could align well with the stage of the company. And speaking a little bit more on that, in terms of like, in your experience, maybe Gigi specifically, seeing a lot of early stage companies start to scale and CEOs then try to, manage different responsibilities or to shift their focus or orientation towards a bigger company. What have you seen, or for anyone else to jump in, like what do you think are the main challenges, and how difficult is it for these CEOs to be able to then transition into a different kind of a role?
Yep.
But also, I think it's interesting to note that some of the best companies, though, have been led by the initial CEOs as well.
Completely. And I think that the companies that become huge and highly successful usually have pretty phenomenal people as their CEOs, and these people are very learning people. And when you talk to Zuck in Facebook, or you talk to some of the other great leaders, you can feel how they are constantly gaining more information. They're kind of extracting knowledge and information and improving and improving and improving and improving and getting better and better and constantly changing. So I think that clearly the best companies are led by leaders that have created the DNA of the company and continue basically evolving over time. Having said that, it is very tough. It's tough because every time that what you need are new superpowers that you did not have before. Every time, like I always warn CEOs in every company that when you move to that kind of 40 people company to that 100 people company, or first when you move to that 6-7 people to the 30-40. And which is where you stop knowing when everybody's going to the toilets and you start just knowing who they are and what's happening in their lives a little bit. And then when it moves to the 30, 40 to the 100, we're struggling to remember everybody's name, but you don't remember the spouses and you don't know their personal stories as well. And then it moves from the 100 to 250. And then suddenly you go up the elevator and somebody asks you, so what do you do in the company? And they just joined 2 days ago, and so your basic your power in the company, your ability to control everything is changing, and all these shifts are huge tension points for CEOs. And so my strong recommendation is, first of all, to keep close to your people that have been through that, and in that regard, I don't think that I'm talking about like professional investors or something. I'm talking about people that actually went through the scaling challenges of a company. Because this is not something that generally an investor that sat on the sidelines would be able to tell you. It needs to be somebody that actually went through the problems, felt the pains, and managed to overcome them, or not, or failed in overcoming them. The second thing is that I would really recommend that you get yourself, if you don't have that in your investor base or in your direct advisors base, somebody that you can really rely on, then get somebody external who's an expert in coaching CEOs in that scaling process. Many CEOs feel that taking coaching is like, showing weakness. It's actually the other way around. When there's a transition that you need to make that you're not capable of doing on your own, it's stupid to not take. And if you're not sure whether you're capable or not, then get somebody to make sure that you will be capable of doing it. So I really recommend. There's a bunch of people that I recommend to my companies at these stages that basically help the CEOs scale themselves. Which it's not organizational consultants. They don't tell you, oh, you've got to put a COO. They are helping the CEOs scale their own capabilities. And so between surrounding you with people that have been there, and many times, by the way, we would do a round, and the round would be fully oversubscribed, but we would keep a bit of room for people that actually scaled companies, so startup CEOs that actually scaled companies, because what we found over the years is that many times it's that one conversation with such a person that went through the same thing that you're going through, that's going to basically be worth, month of pain or something. So, surround yourself with people that have been through that. Don't be afraid or shy to take on coaches or advisors or whatever it takes to get you through that. And remember that feeling lost, and remember that feeling that you're not sure, and remember that feeling that your source of power, your source of authority in the company is changing is very, very natural. I've had in one of the companies, I'll say one more thing. In one of the companies, I had a CEO that came to me and said, I feel that everything is now suddenly slipping through the cracks and that I'm not in control anymore. And we sat and went through it, and then suddenly I realized, I told him, look, you just moved from a size of a company where you knew what everybody's doing, and you're moving now to the size of a company where you can't know what everybody's doing. Generally, and you can deep dive everyone now and then, but you can't know everything. And if you're not going to change your perspective of what does it mean to be a good CEO from the previous perspective, which was, I know everything that's happening, to the perspective of, I know what teams are doing, and I jump in, and it's my role to know if there's a problem, and then I can jump in, but I would never know what everybody's doing. If you don't change that, you're just going to feel miserable and fail all the time. And so this is really a mental shift that people need to go to. And one of the things I'm trying to do is help my CEOs as much as I can through that transition.
Okay. Any other thoughts, guys?
That was really well said. I think just in terms of CEOs and great leaders, the one thing that I've definitely noticed is that they're open to diverse and broad opinions, especially whenever the gaming industry is getting more diverse and broad at the same time. I think that fits in with what Gigi was saying.
Yeah, I think overall approaching the job with a whole bunch of humility. Like, advice is free most of the time. Most people in the game industry are quite happy to provide their perspectives, and the job is really hard and can be lonely sometimes, and making sure that you feel comfortable reaching out to loads of folks and asking for advice and help, and even internally making sure that you have like some sense of a council or like folks internally that you have, so you can take complicated decisions together, and then finding those entirely unrelated external parties that you can run things past. Really, really useful, really important, really valuable.
Right. And maybe just a quick follow-up question on this topic in terms of like as a company is scaling, and whether it's in terms of the role of the CEO, whether the CEO needs to learn or expand capabilities versus adding specific types of support as part of an executive team. Like Kristian, you mentioned that maybe having a counsel or getting advice from people, but like, is there a specific way you would recommend to get more visibility in terms of your weak points, as far as like how a CEO would need to know what they would need to develop in as far as capability, or who they would need to hire? Like, how should a CEO think about that?
I think it's tricky. I mean, I think those things are genuinely hard. I do think there are very well kind of constructed methodologies around doing 360s that both give you the internal view, but also having really frank conversation, finding a way to have really honest conversations with also your investors and folks who are seeing other things out there. I think it's really, really useful. Most of the time, if your mindset is, I want to improve at this job all the time, I want to get better at this job all the time, right, you will find ways to improve. You will find areas to kind of, you will find areas where you will try out different things. You will experiment. You will talk to lots of people. You will ultimately have kind of insights and epiphanies over time. So long as that's the mindset, I think you will end up in a good place. Yeah.
Okay.
I would say that I think, and what I'm going to say now is something that I think I failed with miserably when I was a CEO in the early days, and I got better at it over time. And that is the fact that in most cases, I feel that the founder CEOs know when things are not going well, and they know when they're not on top of things. The problem is that they're afraid to show vulnerability. And as they're afraid to show vulnerability, what they're basically doing is either avoiding discussing it or just pretending it's not there. That creates eventually weakness. That creates, fear of performance. That creates inability to get help, which is why I think over the years, what I started understanding is that me playing the we're killing it game. Everything's great. We're killing it. It's like, nothing. There's no problem. Everything's just on track. And basically not letting myself feel vulnerable, and then not letting others see that I'm vulnerable, made me a worse CEO. Now, I'm not saying or walking around and constantly saying, I have no idea where we're going. It's really a horrible time. It's, don't work on this. I don't even know if it's worth it. Clearly that's not what I'm saying. But with the people that could basically help you, and with the people that could take part of the burden from you or help you carry it, and even with the people that report to you, that they know more than you think that when things are not perfect. They know more than you think that the numbers are not great. They know if you hire the right people, they definitely know that things are not going as well as you wanted them to. By saying, hey, everything's okay, and not sharing, you're basically weakening yourself, you're weakening the company, and you're taking away your ability to get help. And so for me, one of the biggest insights that I got over the years, and I'm trying to help CEOs with that right now, founders that I invest in. And I think that I got better at it over the years also for myself, which also took a huge load off my shoulders, is that it is okay to be vulnerable. It is okay to say, I don't know. It is okay to say things are not going as well as I wanted them. Well, do you say that out loud when you're out raising money? Maybe you don't. Clearly, you're playing the game. You need to basically balance it. But in most times, pretending as everything's perfect, not asking for help, and not willing to be vulnerable is not something that makes you stronger. It's something that makes you really weaker.
Right.
Yeah, plus like 1,000 on that particular point. Really, really agree with it.
All right, guys. So I thought I could end with one final question, and this question is really around, over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of changes in our society and the world. And so, given these notions of whether it's globalization, communication capabilities, remote work, view of the workplace as potentially supportive of or not supportive of societal values. There's a lot of stuff happening in the world today. And so when you think about a number of the trends, whether it's, technology or societal, is there anything in particular when you think about the role of the CEO? Do you see that changing, or like the focus or the responsibility of the CEO, given the stuff that's happening? Would you predict any specific kind of change? And maybe starting with you, Brian.
It's very complex. I love the question. This is like, it was very interesting being at a company like in the mobile industry, especially during the pandemic, because a lot of things changed. I mean, the interests of our customers changed. They needed access to new things that we needed to provide to them. At the same time, we had 700 plus employees that were very much used to going to work every day and liking and enjoying spending time together. And then all of a sudden, everyone's home. And so like it became more important over those 18 months or whatever for companies really to align with what made the company special, what they're showing up to work for, and like what the greater good of the company is. Maybe it is just great products, but at the same time, it's like you're missing out on that social component and that like human component. So like what else is there? And I think that's led to a lot of people thinking about, trying new things or being entrepreneurs or starting a new business and things like that. And really it's like that's a huge responsibility for the CEO at this point in time, is to make sure that they're building a company and nurturing a company that's receptive to the changing needs of everybody that's there, that all have very, very different backgrounds, particularly different backgrounds from what a CEO would be. So I think, largely a lot of the companies are up to the challenge. They're investing money in certain areas where they need to. They're making key hires in things like, human resources, people operations, benefits, and also, thinking more comprehensively about where they're asking their people to show up in a given day, because their time is valuable and people are, not used to commuting anymore. I think this is going to be a big changing point for the industry. A lot more remote work, a lot more openness to employing folks from other countries that may have a big time gap that you were uncomfortable with before. But I think all this stuff is happening very much in real time. I'm sure the other guys have something similar.
What do you think, Gigi?
Yeah, so I think that generally, without scaring anybody, everything is tougher these days. I think that, recruiting people is tougher. The fight for tech talent, it's the worst it's ever been by far. Like, it's never been that bad. I think that retention is the toughest. I don't want to complain about Gen Zs or complain about, people that now feel that because of the market, staying in one company for 2 years is like way too long, but, retaining people is tougher. And basically creating differentiation for your company is tougher. And so I think that altogether, interestingly enough, what happened is that COVID and the current situation and the current market trends are just, they just mean that the thing that we spoke about before, about your ability to find the best talent, your ability to retain the best talent, your ability to portray a vision and create the right DNA in the company, have just become so much more important. And in a way, I think that what I'm seeing is that if in the past, and I'll be very careful how I say that, but if in the past the balance between good idea, good team was always, more weighted toward the good team, but sometimes you could see an okay team with a great idea succeed. I think that in today's market, that's impossible anymore. I think that in today's market, because it's so much more difficult around people, it's so much more difficult around retention, so much more difficult around DNA, so much more difficult to do the basic things that used to be easier with everybody in one office, less offers for everybody. I think that the outcome is that for me, I am so much more focused on best teams versus best ideas, a lot more than before, which means that I think that everything we said before just needs to be, turbocharged right now. I'll just say one more thing. What I have found in the last, I think with the change in the venture capital landscape, and then, the Power Hours is emerging, and a Tiger and Insight and recent Sequoia and all the money that's being thrown at companies. I think that I have found also that being able to fundraise to fundraise well has become a strategic capability that's almost inseparable from the CEO's ability to succeed today. So, you see two companies, and one of them has a CEO who's a great salesperson, and that company goes out and raises 100 million, while the other one with this, with similar data, can only raise 10 million, and that's it, because the 100 million just sucks the air out of the room. So nobody wants to go for that other company that's doing the same thing but only has 1/10 the money, and the employees start thinking that maybe they chose the wrong company, and the customers are seeing that $100 million round, saying that's probably the market leader. And so, I don't like that. As a founder, I don't necessarily like that, but I think that fundraising has become a much more strategic capability than before.
Interesting. Okay, Kristian.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think one way to characterize it, I think a lot of studios and game companies have become really open and in some ways enamored with the idea of being fully remote and completely distributed. And it's great because you have access to talent all over the world. You can scale much more seamlessly. There's many things it's easier to build a more diverse company that way. But I think not enough time and attention, are being spent today on the trade-offs that come with that strategy, in particular for all the stuff Gigi was talking about earlier, in terms of making sure that truly the culture of the company is great, making sure that there is the right amount of camaraderie, the right trust between people, the right sense of shared journey, that how do you have an allegiance to how do you feel like it's worth sticking with this team and with this company and with these people? These are my people. Right. How do you make it feel like that through a Zoom lens? And that's really hard. And I think one of the most important things that, I found myself spending an awful lot of time on, but I think this is really universally true for companies that are committed to being remote first, the way that we are today and have been, frankly, even pre-pandemic, is that commitment has to be absolute. You have to do whatever it takes to make talent in particular kind of feel empowered, feel part of it, have fun together, do extra invest really hard in this idea of making yourself firstly an attractive employer from the perspective of people joining, but also for anybody once they are joined, they need to have your employee net promoter score needs to be as high as it possibly can be for all the reasons that Gigi outlined. The war for talent is insane out there right now. And at the end of the day, through all the ups and downs and sideways turns of any individual company, any individual game, or even for the whole industry for that matter, talent is kind of forever. It's the one common denominator for things which end up being successful. So, and attracting that talent, holding on to that talent, I think in this world that we're moving on, that is moving toward, which is, remote first more broadly, but also that is in lots of ways just you're much more expected to bring your whole self to work and be a group of I guess open friends, in addition to being kind of co-workers, and doing that without a physical space. It really is a skill, and I think evolving that skill together as a company, I think is more important now than it's ever been.
Got it. All right, gentlemen. Well, that was all the questions that I had. I really want to thank you guys for really great insights and for your time today. And with that, for our audience, we'll catch you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.